With very rare exception, lager beers are expected to be crisp and refreshing with a clean fermentation character, which is a function of the yeast used to ferment these styles. Of course, there are certain rules brewers are implored to follow when fermenting lager styles with lager yeast. This is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Will Lovell to talk about a topic that we've spent a surprising amount of time on: lager fermentation temperature, namely the impact fermenting a lager warm with the world's most popular lager yeast has on a Festbier.
Yeah, this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, and it still remains a pretty hot topic. Pardon the dad joke. So I'm always happy to talk about it. I think it's a fun one to talk about. There's a lot of demystification that comes along with some of these topics and things that we can unravel. So I'm really excited to chat about this with you today.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, we have done more experiments on fermentation temperature than any other single variable, most of which have been focused on lagers, I think for a very understandable reason. And the reason for this is that we refuse to accept a single data point as fact. So by repeating experiments over and over with different beer styles and yeast strains, among other little differences, we do inch closer and closer to the truth. And honestly, this is just a topic that I also like to talk about. I think it's very interesting, given the, I put it in air quotes, but the rules with which we've all, been told we have to ferment lagers. And obviously we've been doing things differently for quite a while. So I'm looking forward to this one. All right, if you enjoy this show and you'd like to receive a reward for helping us to keep producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique perks from YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to either a monthly live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor or a Q&A with somebody in the brewing world. Learn more about all of the rewards we have to offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. Also, if you wouldn't mind leaving a rating and review of our show in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate that as well, as it makes us easier to find for those who may not have heard of us yet. And huge props to all the people who have been leaving us reviews over the last month. It's been really appreciated. All right, feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used both their 120 volt and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, both of them are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20 gallon brew in a bag homebrewing starter kits, as well as a plethora of other gear and ingredients. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and go visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Sean Bernard from Hope, Idaho, wrote in with some feedback after watching a video I made demonstrating what I think is a pretty cool technique. Sean said, "I'm loving using the keg purge method you talked about and demoed, where you use a jumper to connect the fermenter blow-off to a keg filled with sanitizer and a liquid line to an empty bucket. I've used this method for the past few batches, and it works great. One extra plus that I don't think you mentioned is that when you cold crash, the suckback pulls a little sanitizer back into the keg, as opposed to the risk of pulling sanitizer into the fermenter or having to create and monitor positive pressure in the fermenter during cold crash. When I'm ready to transfer the beer into the keg, I just do a quick purge to push out the little bit of sanitizer that got back into the keg during cold crash, and I have a fully purged and sanitized keg with minimal CO2 used. Thanks for the tip and all of the awesome content." Sean, I'm so glad that method is working out for you as well as it does for me. Will, is this something that you've tried out yet?
I've done it quite a few times. Sometimes I just get lazy and don't do it. But it's a great way to save money on lots of things like CO2, because you're saving money there because you're using something that nature's already producing for you to push all that sanitizer out of that keg. I like his comment about the suckback, because I'd be actually curious how much suckback you get during a cold crash with this method, because that's really kind of a curious idea to me, to just kind of use the bucket, blow off bucket as a will to suck sanitizer back in. And I'm actually now kind of want to weigh the empty keg versus how much suck back you get, because that's kind of where my mind immediately went to when you brought up that actual observation. So that's a pretty cool thing that I haven't thought to do. But yes, I think this is a great method. I think it's a great way to save money, purging your kegs and, save on that CO2.
Without a doubt. And the reason, Sean, that I didn't mention the whole suckback thing, which good call, is because I've never actually left those kegs connected during the cold crashing step. I always disconnect the kegs and attach CO2 set to like 1 or 2 PSI to my fermenter before I cold crash. But for those who don't do that, like you, Sean, yeah, that's just another, I would say, benefit, in addition, of course, to the cost savings on CO2 and the massively reduced risk of cold side oxidation. The fact that you're sucking, that suck back is going into a keg as opposed to the beer. Yes, another check mark on the benefit side, in my opinion. So really good stuff, Sean. I appreciate you sharing that with us. Again, I find it much easier just to disconnect the whole, keg setup and put a little bit of CO2 directly on the fermentation vessel during the cold crash step, which again is going to avoid any oxygen coming into the fermenter like you might get if you had an airlock on there, but also completely eliminate any suck back because there's CO2 instead of, sanitizer. So yeah, good stuff, Sean. Appreciate you reaching out. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Don't forget to snag some Brülosophy merch over at brülosophy.com/shop. We are offering more options than we ever have before, like t-shirts, hoodies, and hats, to fanny packs, shorts, coffee mugs, tank tops, mobile phone cases, stickers, and so many other things. We have done our best to keep prices as low as possible, and international shipping is available. Again, you can head to brülosophy.com/shop, click one of the product images on that page, and that will redirect you to our Dashery store. Or you can go directly there by either going to brülosophy.dashery.com or clicking the link in the description of this episode. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of work, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 PSI of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The very first lager I made was a very simple Bow Pils, or what I believe the BJCP now refers to as a Czech pale lager. It was over a decade after I'd started brewing. That's how long it took me to muster the courage to make this style of beer that I'd heard was so difficult to do right. I followed all of the rules as best as I could in terms of fermentation and lagering, and that amounted to a grain to glass time of over 7 weeks. Look, I'm a pretty patient dude, but that sucked. 7 to 2 whole months, It wasn't long after that that I started questioning what I had been taught about lager fermentation, in part because of the experimentation that we do. But before we get into all of that, let's get some generals of lager fermentation and fermentation in general out of the way.
Yeah, so there's basically, lager fermentation, ale fermentation, it doesn't matter. Temperature control is considered to be one of those must-haves. You need to be able to kind of control your temperature, with the exception maybe being the Kveik strains that can go super hot and be like crazy. But even those, temperature does seem to affect flavor. So, but normally we are predisposed to believe that cooler temps are associated with cleaner fermentation, because what do? They suppress ester development, and those are those fun chemical compounds that lend fruity notes to beer, and maybe that lovely pear note that you have in your English ale is something that's desirable, and maybe something in your lager strain that you don't necessarily want. So it just depends on the strain that you're using, whether or not you want some of those ester profiles to be there. But it's a function of the yeast strain, kind of the work composition, fermentation conditions. But temperature is a big lever that you push on with ester development with those, whatever yeast strain that you're using.
Yeah, and obviously, conversely, warmer temperatures are associated with the opposite of that. That you're going to produce more of those fruity esters and fusel alcohols, and if you go too warm, it can lead to other off flavors as well. So as brewers, like you said, we've sort of been brainwashed has a negative connotation, but it has been drilled into us to ferment at the right temperature for your yeast strain. The thing that's interesting to me, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Will, is that we tend to view, or at least in my experience as a brewer for the last 20 plus years, it really does seem like the common mentality when it comes to fermentation and yeast is that even though we have these ideas about, traditional lager yeast need to be fermented at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take, which is 10 C, and, ales get fermented at room temp or 68 Fahrenheit, 20 C, and that's just what you do. But we still view the impact of things like temperature the same. We apply it all, this kind of filter, this mental filter to every yeast strain out there, meaning, if you ferment cool, it's going to be clean. And if you ferment warm, it's going to be estery, fruity, and have these off flavors, or maybe not even off flavors. Maybe they are desirable, like Saison, right? You ferment that up in the 70s. Right. But they're one of the things that I feel like I've been forced to reconsider, or part of what has influenced my reconsideration of fermentation temperature in general, are our experiments. And it's led me to try to view, like, each strain is its own unique thing, and it's going to react and respond. What are your thoughts about that?
I think my favorite thing that I ever hear people say, and it gets said all the time, just go on Facebook or whatever, your Reddit or wherever, is that lagers like cool temperatures. And I'm here to tell you, I don't think they like cool temperatures, because they reproduce like crazy when it's warmer, and they reproduce really slow when it's cold. So I don't know that they like cool temperatures. I think we need to just understand that they tolerate it. And I think some of that is a function of something we're going to talk about a little bit, which is like history, which drives a lot of our brewing. What do we want to call it? Brewing lore? Is that a good way to say it?
Like, I think so.
Our brewing legacy. And so, again, it's part of that. And I agree, like, yeast strains are so individualized. When I'm using a Belgian Sac Cerevisier strain, I'll push it way warmer, because I'm trying to get some of those phenols out of that yeast that I wouldn't necessarily want to get from like a Chico strain per se. But I do think we just have these kind of conceptions that, you can get too warm. You can kill things and kill off your yeast because it's too hot, right? You're not going to ferment all this at, 200 degrees Fahrenheit, because that'll just kill off everything. But, we do want to just recognize that they reproduce like crazy when it's a little warmer. So let's get, so we kind of got to get out of that. Well, they like it cold. Well, they tolerate cold. And yes, it may produce flavors that you're more interested in producing, but they do reproduce like crazy when it gets warm. So, but, generally speaking, most ale yeast, what's the preconception? We get about 68 Fahrenheit, 20 C for the Sac Cerevisier strains out there. And then most lager yeast, again, Saccharomyces pasteurans, we're looking at 50 degrees, 10 C. And again, I think a lot of that is, the lore that is built into this thing, a lot coming from the history that is there, because again, Germans, what do? They brewed in the wintertime. They had a law against brewing in summer, basically. So they brewed in the wintertime, and they were storing things in caves in the meantime. So they needed it to be tolerant of cold German winter. And so they found these strains that were tolerant of the wintertime. And so that's kind of how we get this kind of lore, this theory that, for good traditional German lagers, it needs to be fermented cold. Sure, it can be, but I don't think it has to be. And so we kind of get stuck in this little bit of lore that comes a lot from the history of the past of this brewing tradition, which is fantastic. Keep the tradition alive. But if we go real crazy, they didn't have thermometers either, so I don't really know how we know how cold they had it or not. So
they were touching the outside of their barrels. Oh yeah, that feels about right. Here's the thing, and I don't mean to be pedantic here, but I there's a point to what I'm about to say. Liking something, preference is a function of a prefrontal cortex. It's a function of the very unique aspects of the brain that we have, right? So yeast don't have that. They don't have preferences. What it is that they tend to perform better under certain conditions. And one of those conditions, and this is regardless of whether it's a Pastorianus or Cerevisier strain or whatever, the warmer the temperature up into certain, obviously there are going to be thresholds. If you boil yeast, it kills it. But the warmer the temperature up to about, 100 F, which is like 35 C, I think, they're going to be faster. They're going to replicate faster. They may also, as science has shown, produce certain characteristics that are perceptibly desirable and or undesirable under those conditions. So that is the way I like to look at it. And, we have this tendency as human beings to apply meaning And I think it's usually kind of selfish. We do it to confirm what we think, but we apply certain meaning to things based on observation as opposed to actual evidence. So what I mean in this context is you have all these Germans who figure out, man, if we just brew when it's cooler and we put these beers in a cave, which are naturally going to maintain a nice, cool environment. It's a consistently cool temperature. Well, what we know happened was that favored certain types of yeast strains, Pastorianus, which again is this kind of cross between a couple of, we'll talk about this in a minute, but a couple of different Cerevisiae, Saccharomyces cerevisiae and this Eubayanus come together and they produce Sac Pastorianus, which we, all believe now you have to ferment at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Whereas the way I look at it nowadays is, well, maybe we told ourselves we have to because that's what was happening when, it became a thing. But it's almost like we limited options for fermenting warmer because it worked so well fermented cool. I mean, how many people I looked before we started doing and I'm not patting ourselves on the back by any means, but before we started doing our lager fermentation temperature experiments, the only references I ever saw to warm lager fermentation were either from people who were, I would say, hating on, fermenting lagers warm, who would present some anecdote and, you'd start to dig and realize that it wasn't even them who brewed the beer or whatever, or just people repeating what they've read or heard from another podcast or something like that. I did it. I did the same exact thing. I was wholly convinced you cannot ferment lagers warm up until I started doing it and actually designing our version of a controlled experiment to test it out. So that's my little soapbox thing that I wanted to get, this idea that
I'll give you full credit. Before you and Brülosophy started doing these tests, I stayed away from lager brewing altogether because, and which is sad because I really love lager. I love light lagers. I love dark lagers. I love amber lager. I love it all. I love the whole spectrum. And so I stayed away from these types of beer because of all the lore. I'm going to keep using lore because I think it's as good as you can have. All the lore around this and all the tradition around this and all the, and I guess there is some scientific evidence with gas chromatographs and things like that where things are happening. So I'm not trying to dispute objective science versus perception testing, but the reality is that, I've once I started warm fermenting beers, I was making beers that I liked with equipment that I had and didn't have to go out and buy crazy stuff. And then the second best part is that I even put those in competitions and was winning awards with warm fermented lagers for people that loathed warm. And the judges were people that I knew that loathed warm fermented lager discussion and things. And so we talk about, the downside of warm fermentations being you'll get all these like esters and potential, I guess they're only an off flavor if you don't want them there, but potential off flavors or undesirable flavors. And I remember having a conversation, but we don't talk about the flip side where I had a conversation with a local home brewer, Chris Daly. He's actually started his own homebrew shop called Varsity Brews. I'll throw him a plug here in San Antonio. And he's a great guy, but he asked me about diacetyl, and he's like, dude, what do you do to prevent diacetyl? And I realized that since I've been doing most of my lagers warm, I don't worry about diacetyl. It's not even a problem that enters my head. So that we talk about all the potential downsides, but diacetyl and the ability for yeast at warmer temps to consume all that, because you have the potential to stay too cold for too long before you do your diacetyl rest, and there's not enough oomph left in your yeast to kind of eat, consume the rest of that stuff out of there. And so we talk about all the downside of this cold, not doing it cold, but there is an upside to not doing it that cold as well.
Well, so here's the thing. I agree with you. And I've done the same thing where I've had people who are diehard, and I say this respectfully, this is just beer. I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but diehard lager traditionalists, right? And this is how I kind of got going in the experiment stuff was I would try, not intentionally try to fool my friends, but when somebody makes such a claim of certainty and they speak it with such authority, I'm the kind of guy who wants to test that out, and I'll usually do it in some sort of a covert way. And so I did the same thing. I started making lagers, fermenting them warm, and I would serve them to my diehard traditionalist friends. And, for the first few, they just thought they were good lagers. And then as they started to realize, Marshall's the guy who's going to ferment these warm. It's funny, a few of them they'd look at me and they'd be like, I get esters. You fermented it warm, right? And I'm like, nope, not this one. Oh, okay. Then that's not what I'm getting. And then I'd come back and tell them again, like, no, I actually did. And you're probably not getting esters. That confirmation bias is so strong. So I've also submitted, I've told this story so many times, but the best I ever did was a Vienna lager that I fermented with, I believe it was 3470, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And I fermented it at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, submitted it to back when the National Homebrew Competition was much bigger than it is today. And I scored like a 40, I think a 44 in the first round on a warm fermented Vienna lager. Come on, if that's going to be the bar by which we gauge, how quality or good a lager beer is. So now there is something that I think is interesting that I want to break down. This does not get talked about that much. And so, here we go. We're going to go into this. When it comes to Saccharomyces pastorianus, right? Your traditional lager strain. There are actually two, I guess the best word would be like lineages or groups that they are clustered into. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that it has to do with like the DNA they inherited from their parent strains, which again, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, that is your classic ale or even bread yeast, that we have put to major use for the growth and building of civilizations, to making delicious beers. But then there's this Saccharomyces eubayanus, and those two come together and they create what we call Saccharomyces pastorianus. Now, it's very easy to view that as just being kind of its own strain, but there are actually these two types. Group 1 is what people refer to as the Satz type, and this group includes older lineages like classic, the Carlsberg, what they used to ferment that, I believe Weihenstephan 2000 and 27 or 2278 are versions of that. These are, and I had to quote this because I'm not a microbiologist, but they are triploid, leaning heavier on that eubayanus side genetically, which makes them highly cold tolerant, but typically slower fermenters that leave behind some more complex sugars. Okay. I've experienced, when I'm using the Pilsner or Kell strain, I've experienced slower fermentations, slower starts. So I think that's kind of interesting. Well, type 2 or group 2, which they call the Froberg type, includes the most popular traditional lager yeast strain, which the Weihenstephan strain or W3470. And these strains are tetraploid, carrying more genetic material from the Cerevisiae side. So keep that in mind. Sac Cerevisiae, your typical common ale/bread yeast. These are known for being robust fermenters. They can handle maltotriose efficiently, and they deliver a clean, classic profile. Well, what do we know about Sac Cerevisiae? That it ferments beautifully at about 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 C. You've got this Froberg type, the number one most popular, according to what I've found everywhere online, the most popular lager yeast strain in the world, and it leans more heavily into the Cerevisiae side. I'll let you make of that what you will, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us to the topic or the star of this particular experiment that we're going to discuss, which is the Imperial Yeast L13 Global 3470, which is the Weihenstephan strain from a brewery in Munich, Germany. And this is a really great historic strain that goes back to the 17th century, and you just went through all of its great lineages, but essentially they created, when top fermenting German yeast mated with cold tolerant Saccharomyces eubayanus, you just went through all that great lineage. They eventually banked this yeast that they'd kind of been producing through at this point it'd be centuries, in the 1940s. And this 3470 L13 Global isolates are some of the most popular, heavy-hitting, amazing yeast strain that you'll use everywhere. I'm kind of convinced that the reason it's so popular is that every brewery in the U.S. can just get that huge brick from their local brewery supply shop and get that big brick of 3470. And it's just a workhorse. I think it's a workhorse for everybody, and it just produces nice, clean beer. And it's been doing it for apparently a very long time, since the 17th century.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this is one of those strains. To me, it's the Chico of the lager world, right? It is so popular. Every lab, I believe, every major lab at least, offers their version of the Weihenstephan strain. And again, you got to keep in mind, my understanding at least is when these labs, they get their yeast and they're propagating it up themselves, what they're doing is isolating a cell and then they build from there. So it is entirely possible that there are some slight variations from lab to lab on their version of the Weihenstephan strain. My favorite one that I've used is Imperial Yeast L13 Global. That is just their version of 3470. They own it, and they describe it as the world's most popular lager strain. Global is an all-around solid lager strain that produces clean, bright, and crispy lager beers with a very low ester profile. This strain is extremely powdery, so long lagering times or filtration is required for bright beer. I have not found it to be terribly difficult to clear out, and especially if you're using, our favorite clarifier, which is gelatin. It seems to work just fine and clear out very quickly. But yeah, I mean, maybe it doesn't flocculate as well. It's a bit powdery. Other than that, I mean, it gets in there and it just grips it and rips it, right? I mean, that's been my experience. And you've got people like Jordan who are moving to using this lager yeast strain for his hoppy ales. I mean, I think that's pretty telling if you ask me.
Yeah, I think it's kind of where some of the newer styles like cold IPA and some of that come from. Is like, yeah, we're going to do this cold IPA, which really is a warm fermented lager, essentially.
With a lot of hops,
yeah, with a lot of hops, So I think it just gives people that confidence. But I mean, the temperature range on this that they put for Imperial Global is 46 to 56 Fahrenheit, which is about 8 to 13 C. And I know from personal experience that it works great in those temperatures, but I've pushed it all the way up to like close to 80 degrees, and it just works. It just chews. And I had a conversation here with a local brewer, and he talked with a lab that they use for their Weihenstephan strain, and basically that sales rep said that they were wasting time and energy doing it cold. So I'm like, it's like, if you're not doing this warm, then you're just wasting time and energy. And this brewer happened to be kind of more of a traditional lager brewer. So that's kind of funny to me that the rep for that particular lager strain, which I will keep nameless at this point, said, yeah, you're wasting time if you're going cold. So I think a lot has come around with this, but this is one of the more robust lager strains out there. And it is just a workhorse at any cooler all the way up to, like I said, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It's just a workhorse through that entire range. And so I've used this strain so much, it's probably the strain that I'm going to have on hand. I've made things that would have been traditionally ales with this strain just because I kind of like it a little better than Chico. And I'm kind of with Jordan, like just use 3470 for all things because it's widely available. It works great at a broad range of temperatures. And if you have a hoppy beer, it lets the hop shine, and you're not worried about anything that Cerevisier strain might be putting off and distracting from your hops. Yeah,
I couldn't agree more. I mean, if there was one word I had to use to describe the Weihenstephan strain L13 Global, I believe WLP 830. I forget what Yeast version is of it, but it, again, very common. SAF lager W3470, of course. The one word that I would use is robust. I mean, it is so robust, and it takes off quickly regardless of fermentation temperature. Yeah, it'll go a little slower in a colder ferment, but I mean, it always works. It's such a good yeast strain. Now, obviously there are other factors. We talked about this earlier, other factors that contribute to the ultimate kind of yeast contribution, flavor contribution in a beer. It's not just temperature. That does get most of the focus. But one of the things that we found as well, and this, I think a lot of people believe this, regardless of whether you're using ale or lager yeast, is that your wort composition, and by which I mean the strength of that wort, the types of, the level of maltotriose, all of that stuff could have an impact on what byproducts that fermentation or that yeast actually produces during fermentation. So, a lot of our past lager fermentation experiments are on your classic lower to moderate ABV styles of beer. You're looking at German Pils, Helles, even stuff like that. So a Vienna lager, like I talked about earlier. One of the styles that is known for being slightly stronger is Festbier. And so I really like that Jake used this style for this experiment. We'd already done several, lager fermentation temperature experiments using this strain, among other strains. And Jake wondered, what happens though if we bump up that OG a bit? Is that going to kick this strain into producing, when it's fermented warm, into producing these byproducts that people are so afraid of, and use that to justify putting the work into fermenting cool and lagering for a long time. So Festbier is described by the BJCP as a smooth, clean, pale German lager with a moderately strong malty flavor and a light hop character. Deftly balances strength and drinkability with a palate impression and finish that encourages drinking. It showcases elegant German malt flavors without becoming too heavy or filling. I love Festbier. I mean, this is the style now that's the most associated with Oktoberfest, hence the name. It kind of took over Märzen, and it is a great style of beer.
Oh, Festbier is one of my favorite beer styles. Again, if you want me to drink a liter of something, Festbier is about as good as you can put in front of me, because again, I do like the competitive, old school, more traditional Märzen, but a liter of Festbier is a little bit more refreshing and hard to beat. And so, but one thing that is common amongst Festbiers is that they are a lager. They are recommended to ferment around lager temperatures, so around that 48 to 52 Fahrenheit, 9 to 11 C. So again, I think this is a great choice. I think it's a fantastic kind of variable to show it off and see if it does have an impact on maybe some of these like bigger, maltier beers versus, say, an American light lager.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you think about how it's not, I would not call Festbier like a super strong beer or a big beer by any means, but it does have a higher OG. And, the higher that OG, the harder that yeast has to work to plow through those sugars. That can lead to more exothermic heat being created during fermentation, which if that's an issue, you would hope to be able to taste it, or expect maybe to be able to taste it. So now look, L13 Global, the Weihenstephan strain, was not the first lager yeast that I fermented warm with. That was actually the Pilsner Urquell strain. It was White Labs WLP 800. But L13 is the yeast that I'm using the most. It's what I have the most experiences with in terms of making lagers. And I'm telling you, again, so robust. However, most of my experiences with this yeast have been in single batches, whether that's for a short shoddy or a brew it yourself, just making a beer to drink for my friends. Well, contributor Jake Houlihan was curious of the impact fermenting this yeast warm has on a Festbier, and he put it to the test. Those results when we're back from this break. Stop guessing and start perfecting your craft with Brewfather, the ultimate tool for recipe design. Brewfather Premium unlocks advanced inventory tracking, tilt integration for real-time fermentation monitoring, and seamless cloud sync across all of your devices. But wait, there's more. Premium Plus just changed the game with Brewfather's brand new AI recipe integration. Whether you're looking to clone a rare commercial classic or need a creative spark for a unique grain bill, Brewfather AI helps you build balanced, world-class recipes in seconds. Brewing is a science. Make it art with Brewfather Premium Plus by visiting brewfather.app today. That's brewfather.app. Better beer is just a click away. I'm convinced most new brewers avoid making lagers because of the quote requirements or mandates that they be fermented cool and then lagered for a long time, which not only requires special gear, but obviously additional time. And then, you add that lagering time onto it, and it just becomes very unapproachable for a lot of people. Treating them like we do ales would certainly simplify the process, which would be great, but only if it doesn't ruin the beer. And by ruin, I mean make it taste like it's not a lager. This is something contributor Jake Houlihan tested out in an experiment on a Festbier.
Yeah, so basically what Jake did is he took a single 10-gallon batch of Festbier, and the malt bill was pretty straightforward. It was 49% Pilsner malt, 49% light Munich malt, and then 2% honey malt. And I'm guessing he put the honey malt in there to kind of get that Maillard reaction kind of, I don't know, little excess that they do for some of those kind of Maillard malts to get that kind of reaction, I'm guessing.
Here's the thing. When it was like 15 years ago, if you mentioned that you were using honey malt, the purist would be like, oh, you're going to create it's almost like the way people view crystal malt, right? Honey malt, to me, does not contribute a very strong sweet or honey note. To me, it's almost more nutty. So yeah, maybe that is a Maillard thing, or I'm not sure. At 2%, I have to imagine he was probably using it mostly for color or something, because I just don't think you're going to taste very much of honey. Based on my experience using honey malt in various percentages, I'm not sure 2% is going to be all that noticeable. But when you think about a Festbier, to me it kind of works.
Yeah, I don't have any problems with it, but again, 2%. Maybe he just had a bag he's trying to get rid of. Who knows?
Something like that.
I've done that. I've totally done that. So, bottom of the bag. Yeah, let's just add this. Let's get it off the shelf. Brewing process, again, pretty straightforward. He did a full volume single infusion mash at 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 C for 60 minutes. Once the sweet wort was collected at the end of the mash step, it was boiled for 60 minutes. And then he did his kettle hop additions, which was a 30-minute addition of 22 grams of laurel, and then a 5-minute addition of 22 grams of Tettnang, which sounds like a really nice hop combination for this style of beer. It sounds lovely. And then after the boil, Jake chilled the wort and split them evenly between two identical fermenters, and he clocked in his OG at 1053.
Yeah, so you look at that OG, again, nothing crazy, but it is about 5 specific gravity points higher than you might see in a Helles or a German Pils. So a little bit more for that yeast to have to chew on and work on. And just a comment real quick, Jake really got into using laurel. I remember this, and I've used laurel several times. It is a really unique, in a good way, hop variety, in my opinion. It really leans heavily, in my experience at least, into that kind of floral, but almost like sweet floral, not sugary sweet, but that kind of nice sweet floral thing. You imagine that with Tettnang, which again, that's one of my favorite classic noble hops. It really is a nice blend. I think the reason he went with his initial edition being at 30 minutes was because this is a Festbier. It's not expected to be super, bitter, but just enough to balance out the other aspects of the beer. You add laurel, which is a moderately, high AA or alpha, acid percentage. At 30 minutes, you get the best of both worlds. You get some of that flavor and aroma as well as the bitterness potential. So I like his call on that.
Yeah, I think it's pretty great. And so then at this point, he filled the fermenters, and then I guess he had the magic of glycol at this point, because I'm looking at the pictures on the website, and it seems like he has a nice, lovely glycol unit, which means he got some pretty stellar temperature control. And so one was controlled at 50 Fahrenheit or 10 C, and the other one was controlled at 72 Fahrenheit or 22 C. So that's a pretty big temperature gap there between the two of them. And once both were stabilized at their respective temperatures, Jake pitched a pouch of Imperial Yeast L13 Global in each batch. And with both beers showing no signs of fermentation after 3 weeks, Jake took hydrometer measurements with identical attenuation at 1015 FG, which that's kind of interesting that they still got identical attenuation, even being at that such a large disparity between their fermentation temperatures.
Well, let's look at this real quick. So he fermented one at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and the other at 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That is past where even we ferment lagers warm when we're brewing blasphemous batches, 72. I mean, I ferment my lagers at 66 degrees Fahrenheit these days. That's 19 C. He went with a 22 degree Fahrenheit or 12 C delta between these batches. I don't think there are many people on Earth who are going to think that that's not going to produce some sort of a difference, if they brew at least.
I would expect the attenuation for the cold one to have crashed out well before the 10-15 mark at this rate, though, because again, usually you warm those up towards the end of fermentation.
Well, and that's the other thing is that he pitched identical pitch rates into these. Just one 200 billion pouch of L13 Global went into the 50 degree batch, and the same amount went into the 72 degree Fahrenheit batch. Again, this is breaking rules. Why do we do that, by the way? People, why didn't you pitch the proper rate? Well, then you're adding in another variable, right? We're keeping pitch rate constant, and yet he still got the same exact attenuation. Again, just speaks to the robustness of that Weihenstephan strain, in my opinion. Now, he didn't have too many comments on when fermentation kicked off for each, though So I would, have to expect that the cold fermented batch had a longer lag phase. That would make perfect sense to me, particularly since he didn't make a starter or anything like that. And that the warmer one probably kicked off maybe 12, 20 to 24 hours quicker than the cold fermented one. That can cause some anxiety, and maybe that's a good excuse for making those lagers. We have not gotten into the organoleptic differences between these beers yet, but right off the bat, after 3 weeks of fermentation, they are at the same exact 1015 FG. And I think that's, for a first data point, I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, 3470 is indeed a workhorse. So anyways, the beers were transferred to kegs, placed in his keezer where he left them for 8 weeks before they were ready for evaluation. And at this point, if you take a look at them, we can get on the website and take a look at the two beers and look at them side by side. And what are you seeing, Marshall?
So I am like squinting. I've turned the brightness up on my monitor. They look 99% identical to me, though if I'm really looking hard, one of them does look just slightly more clear than the other one. They both have what I would call like a minimal to moderate haze. I think part of that is just the condensation on the glass. That always is tough to deal with when we're taking these photos. But the one that was fermented warm does seem to look slightly more clear to my eyes. I mean, is that what you're seeing, or?
Yeah, it almost, and again, it's hard to know. I don't know what kind of lighting he used. We're just looking at a picture and with the backdrop inside of his house, right? So it's hard to know what lighting is used. I would say definitely the cool one looks to be maybe a touch clear, maybe letting a touch more light in. But again,
so we disagree on that then. Yeah, I mean that's the thing is like it could be
they're very
just
close. Like it doesn't really matter. But then there's like edges of the glass on the warm one. That one edge on the bottom right of that glass, when you look at the picture, looks a little bit clear. I don't know. It's hard to say with the lighting. I would say that they're more alike than different.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. I've done this experiment several times using L13. I've brewed 20 plus batches using L13 warm in your traditional lager styles, and they clear up very easily, very well, even when I'm not using, for me at least, when I'm not using gelatin. And I was talking with a buddy about that, who is I don't think he's a microbiologist, but he has history in biology. And he goes, well, yeah, it kind of tracks because everything that yeast does is it's going to do it more efficiently and faster in those warmer environments than it's going to in that cooler environment. So all of the stuff that we expect from that yeast is going to happen faster in that warmer beer, right? Well, if it happens slower, that would also include whatever the yeast has to do before it starts dropping out of solution. So even if one of them was a little bit more clear, I would expect it to be the warm one, not because of the condition. To me, that's not a bad sign. It's part of why I think we view these styles as having to be lagered for as long as we do.
Right. And normally, it looks like he kept these at 50 Fahrenheit 10C the entire time for the entire fermentation. And so that kind of makes me too, like if he would have warmed them up for a diacetyl rest, if that would have kind of mitigated some of that. But again, we're trying to keep things constant. So, again, I'm just floored that he got the same starting and finishing gravities with these two beers. So that's pretty awesome. So let's talk about your process here, because I see that this was done during the pandemic that nobody got to go home from. So what was the process that you guys used way back in those dark ages of staying home all the time?
Yeah, so I got a couple comments on this, actually. We've kind of intentionally avoided focusing too much on the experiments that we did for that, 18 months or so during the stay-at-home stuff during COVID-19. But what's weird is that I still get emails from people saying, man, I just wish you guys would do more of this. Like, we've seen all the data from your blind tasters, but there's so much meaning behind the brewer, semi-blinding themselves and doing this type of a process. So we're going to start bringing more of these up because I do think they're interesting. And honestly, there might be a place for us to integrate this, even though it's no longer COVID, because I do think it can tell us something about maybe a little bit more detail about the impact a certain variable has. So the way it worked during COVID is that because we could not go out and collect data from blind participants, we were doing our duty and staying away from other people. What we would do is take 4 cups of the same exact color. So we were using the same cups that we use for our regular data collection, but we would have 4 of them. 2 of them would get filled to the same level with beer from one of the kegs. The other 2 would get filled with beer from the other keg to the same level. We would then take those and mix them up. Usually one of our kids or our wife or whatever would do it. And then they would randomly select 3. Now we would mark the bottom of each cup, right? So we knew which one was which. They would give us 3 of those cups. So every single time, 1 would be different, 2 would be the same, no matter what. And the one that was different was actually would randomly change. Well, we would then do our own series of blind triangle tests. We would do 10 of them, and then we would calculate the results from there. So we would run our regular, one-tailed binomial proportions test and get that p-value. And to us, at the time, we came up with this. We were like, well, it's a good stand-in for our regular data. But like I said, a lot of people have reached out asking if we will do this more often. I'd be curious to hear from some of our listeners what they like and what they think about this type of data collection. Again, this was done wholly by the brewer of the beers, Jake, who knew everything about it. I mean, this is as cited as it comes. The only thing he didn't know was what beer was in what cup, because those were served to him blindly and hence semi-blind. So out of his 10 trials, he would have needed to identify the unique sample 7 times, so 70%, in order for us to say with some level of confidence that, yeah, it really does seem like the variable, in this case, that would be fermentation temperature, did have a meaningful impact on the quality of the beer. There is a difference that we can't quite explain by random, choice. It really does seem to be due to the fermentation temperature. Out of his 10 trials, Jake was correct just 3 times. Mind you, one beer was fermented at 50 degrees. The other one was fermented at 72 degrees. That's 10C and 22C. That is a vast difference. The guy who brewed the beers, who knew everything about them, couldn't tell them apart. He even said that in side-by-side comparisons that he couldn't tell them apart. They looked, tasted, felt in his mouth exactly the same as one another. I find that fascinating.
Again, like we talk about all the warm fermentation downsides, like ester production or phenols or whatever kind of undesirable flavors you might get from that. I would have expected the cold one with no diacetyl rest to be just like, a little bit of that slick mouthfeel or something that would have tipped his hat. So I'm just as impressed that the cold one managed to stay clean, because I've done a lot of warm fermented lagers, so I don't really worry about the warm fermentation one. But I'm just impressed that his cold fermented lager managed not to produce like a bunch of diacetyl or anything crazy like that it wasn't able to clean up. And this just kind of, to me, further proves that this yeast strain is just a beast in a lager brewery and can just chew through anything, no matter what temperature and what grist you throw at it.
So not only that cold one didn't have, certain off flavors, and I'm obviously there are people out there saying, of course it wouldn't, because that's what you're supposed to do. But one of the things about cold fermentation also is sulfur production, particularly with lager strains. We've all experienced that. 3 weeks, and there was still no noticeable sulfur in that cold fermented beer. I mean, again, it speaks to the robustness of 3470, but I think more than anything, it holds that mirror up to, us in our, self-righteous ways. I think we can say that, we just bought hook, line, and sinker what these people hundreds of years were doing and just never really thought differently about it. And there are people out there who look at this and they're like, well, no, there's clearly something amiss here. Are you guys, cheating behind the scenes? Are you just lying? Why would we do that? Who cares? I find this absolutely fascinating, and it goes along, particularly when using W3470 or that Weihenstephan strain, L13 Global. This actually validates prior experiments that we'd done on blind tasters, where blind tasters couldn't taste a difference as well. So make of that what you will. We did publish a article recently that I highly recommend people who, struggle to accept this type of data go check out, where I actually do a full-on review of all of the lager or the fermentation temperature experiments that we've performed. I think I cover 8 of them, and how they are surprisingly consistent, particularly when it comes to lagers. Now, of course, this was W3470, so we can't speak about any other lager strains. And indeed, we have done lager fermentation experiments with other yeast strains like Que Bueno, which is the Grupo Modelo strain, as well as we've done the Pilsner Urquell strain. And there's another, L13 Harvest, which is the Augustiner strain. So that Grupo Modelo and the Augustiner strain did actually produce, we need to do more of these experiments, but they did actually produce a noticeable difference. Those were significant results. But the weird thing is in both of those, after the fact, after doing the triangle test, tasters reported the one that tasted the most lager-like was the one that was warm fermented. So, again, make that make sense.
I mean, do with it what you will. And as far as the, doctoring results, stuff like that, I know as a contributor, I pine for significant results because we get so many not significants that like I pine for significance at this point. It's kind of a weird thing to say, but you sit here and you do all these and you're like, not significant. And sometimes you're relieved because you're like, oh, thank God I don't have to worry about this really complicated thing like trying to keep my firm chamber at the same two different temperatures, one for lagers and one for ales, with the Weihenstephan strain. So this one, it like relieves me because back when I had the firm chamber and I had to like try to have lagers in there when it's cold and, this in there, to get a little warmer, that was a pain in the butt to manage. But so these are relieving, but some of them you're just like, man, it would be great if we got a significant result because I'm so tired and not significant. So I think we kind of pine for those after a while.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I just want to, before we get into reader comments, which we got a few, as we always do on these fermentation temperature experiments, part of this is strain dependence. I'm not denying that. Again, we've shown that different strains do react differently to different temperatures. W3470, the Weihenstephan strain, is the most popular lager yeast used in the world today. If you want to make a lager and you don't have the ability or you don't just want to spend that much time doing it the traditional way, grab yourself some 3470 and ferment it the way that you do an ale. I promise you, at the very least, you're going to make something, assuming everything else is done properly, you are going to make a beer that is not only drinkable, but will probably impress your friends who think that you don't know how to make lager beers. It really is that robust of a yeast strain. So, all right, some reader comments. The first one comes from Blackbeard Brew, who says, since you didn't mention if you were fermenting under pressure, I'll assume that you didn't, and Jake did not ferment these under pressure. Blackbeard Brew says, do you think it might be different results in that case? From what I've read, fermenting under pressure will suppress all the esters that could be produced when fermenting lagers at higher temps. Now, I do have to make a correction. That article that I referenced earlier was about fermenting lagers under pressure. I apologize for that. Do I think it'll make a difference? I don't. I will go on record as saying I think that people have adopted pressurized fermentation. Now, don't get me wrong. There are other like downstream benefits of fermenting under pressure, like natural conditioning or carbonation of your beer during the process, so you don't have to use store-bought CO2. Cool. That's all good. Does it suppress ester formation? In my research, not nearly to the point to justify people doing it just so that they can get away with fermenting warm. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I've done some pressure fermentation experiments personally, and I'm with you. I think the benefit is you save money on CO2. Personally, that's what the benefit of pressurized fermentation is. Is there some? I mean, I don't have a gas chromatograph at home. Is there probably some difference between a pressurized fermentation versus a normal? If you put it under gas chromatograph, I think Martin's actually gotten some of that information. Yeah, sure, there probably is. But as far as like what I could taste, I've done it personally, and it came back not significant, and I couldn't taste the difference. So again, pressurized fermentation is great for saving CO2, and when you cold crash, your beer's already carbonated, so it's pretty nice. You can just pour it off the unit tank that you're fermenting it in and just have a sip before you while you're kegging it into a new keg. So but yeah, I don't think the pressurized fermentation would really make that much of a difference here.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this, that you mentioned Martin's data, that he worked with White Labs on a batch that was pressure fermented. Again, it may very well be strain dependent. There's we use different yeast strains and all of that stuff. What White Labs found was that all of the vast majority, all but one of the byproducts that yeast produce when fermented warm were actually lower in the non-pressurized batch than it was in the pressurized batch. The only thing that was higher, and it wasn't even to a degree that would be past the detectable threshold, I believe was isoamyl acetate, if I'm not mistaken. Go read that article. It's very interesting. I think it is, at least. But there's again, you use the word lore to talk about fermentation temperature with lager yeast. I would say that we've built this lore around pressurized fermentation, and I think most people want to believe that it does something so that they can justify fermenting lagers warm without looking like the fools that we are, right? Again, totally human thing to do. But data is data, and it just doesn't seem to be that impactful. So Blackbeard Brew, no, I don't think that if he had fermented them under pressure, it would have changed anything at all. It sounds like Blackbeard might be presuming that both beers happen to have the same level of esters, when I would contend that both of them probably had very minimal levels of esters, to the point that it likely just wasn't detectable. That's just my opinion. All right. Next comment comes from Jason Gillespie, who says, another nice thing about this experiment is that you pitched a single pouch for the batch fermented at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10C. Calculators would say you need 400 billion cells. L13 is a great yeast, a bit sulfury, but that gives it a good lager character, in my opinion. It can get sulfury if you don't do certain things. I have not had issues with sulfury beers fermented with L13, but I'm purging them, and I'm burst carbonating, and I'm doing diacetyl rests and stuff like that. So I don't know if you had issues with sulfur with L13.
I don't know. I have a local homebrew friend who seems to be very sensitive to sulfur, and I think every beer I ever give him, he says that there's some kind of sulfury component to it. I think he's just very sensitive to it. Apparently I'm not that level of sensitivity, and so I haven't tasted sulfury beers. Like, I've never had like the sulfur stinky egg bomb in my kegs from 3470 or L13 Global. I've used this yeast strain a lot, but that's not to say that there aren't people out there that are sensitive to it and find it to be too sulfury. But I'm not one of those people. I don't think I'm as sensitive to it as others are.
Yeah. Either I smell sulfur easily, and I've definitely gotten it with L13, but it always blows off. Sulfur is one of the easier things to get rid of in a beer, because you could just blow off your keg and it'll eventually get rid of it. I think the bigger point that Jason makes, though, is that, yeah, this was also in a sort of way a pitch rate experiment as well. That 50 Fahrenheit beer got half the amount of yeast that it, quote, should have gotten, and yet still produced a beer that was indistinguishable from the one fermented warm. I think that's fascinating. We've done a lot of pitch rate experiments. I'm not saying pitch rate doesn't matter. I view pitch rate as being more of an insurance thing than anything else. It's not a requirement, but it does increase the chances that you're going to have a nice, strong start with reduced lag, which reduces the chances of some other microbe taking over. So yeah, I'm not anti pitch rate, but I think 200 billion cells in a 50 degree Fahrenheit, Festbier is probably going to work out fine for most people, especially with a robust yeast like L13. All right, final comment. This one is really interesting to me. Todd says, assuming Global really is derived from 3470, Fermentis performed a multi-condition experiment looking at the effects of pitch rate, temperature, and gravity using both qualitative and quantitative methods. So qualitative would be more like what we do, though we do kind of quantify it a little bit. Quantitative methods would be putting it under like a lab equipment, all that stuff. They too found higher temperatures didn't really impact the characteristics of the beer. And if anything, lower temperatures are more problematic. I don't have access, or I did not go and find this particular experiment article that Todd is referencing, but it's fascinating to me that even Fermentis, who is probably the provider of most of the 3470 or Weihenstephan yeast out there, could not, prove that cold fermentation temperatures are necessary to producing that clean characteristic we expect from that yeast.
Well, right. And even when you do cold, again, you're supposed to warm it up for that nice diacetyl rest to kind of blow off some of that sulfur and also kind of eat through some of those diacetyl flavors that you probably don't want for lager fermentation. And so I don't know. I didn't read this article either, and I didn't go back to find that Master Brewers podcast that I think he refers to somewhere in here. But I do agree that I think there are some other problematic things about fermenting cold that we don't talk about very much that warm fermentation does solve for, as long as you're willing to kind of put yourself out there and take the risk.
Absolutely. And on that note, I just want to say one more time, if you have been avoiding making lager beers because you're afraid of having to ferment them cool, you don't have the gear to do it, give this a shot. You are not going to make, again, you got to do all the other stuff right. Mind your sanitation. Don't use super old yeast, nothing like that. Pitch a pouch of L13 Global into a 1050 OG wort. Let it ferment at ale temps. You're not going to have to lager for as long. I would encourage you to fine it with something like gelatin, or if you're vegan or vegetarian, you could go with something like Biofine Clear. Once it's clear, carbonate that beer up, drink it. I think you're going to be impressed with the outcome. And on that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to The Brülosophy Show over at youtube.com/@The Show. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on Brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman, no.